Welcome to the De Morgan Foundation's talk, Centered Visions, with our guest today, Dr. Christina Bradstreet. Christina is the author of Centered Visions, Smell in Art 1850 to 1914, now out with Penn State University Press. She manages adult online learning at the National Gallery in London and creates art mediations for a new app by Kunstell, having written and narrated a series of 5-minute mediations for the National Gallery during the COVID-19 lockdowns. Christina studied Victorian painting at the Courtauld Institute of Art, and her PhD was awarded Birkbeck's and Humphrey's Prize for the best thesis in the field of 19th century studies. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Christina Bradstreet for today's talk. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me. It's meditations that I've written for the National Gallery. I love the idea of mediating through art. I'm sure that's possible, but it's meditations. Thank you. So I'll just share my slides with you first of all. Yeah, I think that's done. And so in this talk today, I'm going to explore the role and significance of scent in Pre-Raphaelite and aesthetic painting, which is largely the subject of my book, Centered Visions. And I'm going to start with a cartoon, which is actually the cartoon that I start the book with. By way of introducing my topic today. So it's an image that puts scent at the heart of Victorian aestheticism. So I'm showing you Max Beerbohm's Dante Gabriel Rossetti in his back garden, published in 1904. And at the centre of the image, we have a dreamy, droopy Edward Burne-Jones. Here he is, nonchalantly presenting a flower to a wallaby. Or perhaps it's a kangaroo, but I think a wallaby to sniff. So an allusion to the painter-poet Rossetti's penchant for keeping exotic pets at his Chelsea home. And surrounding this cameo is a caricatured cast of Victorian art world figures from the circle of the Pre-Raphaelites and aesthetic movement. And I hope it's okay that I'm assuming that you as De Morgan Foundation audience have at least some awareness of these movements and these players. So among them, the poets Algernon Charles Swinburne impishly tweaking the quiff of a prancing James McNeill Whistler, and a larger than life William Morris. Where I've lost my William Morris. Where's my William Morris? Here. Pontificating behind Elizabeth Siddle. Oh, here, sorry, William Morris pontificating behind Elizabeth Siddle, the languorous muse posing for Rossetti, his Rossetti, all observed by a hawk-nosed, keen-eyed John Ruskin. For the dandy and humorous Beerbohm, playfully looking back on aestheticism in his 1904 book, The Poet's Corner, the image of sniffing a flower and appreciating its scent offers a simple and direct way to encapsulate and parody Victorian aesthetic sensibilities. Here, this simple gesture embodies several key concepts for aestheticism: hedonism, pleasure in exquisite sensations, and preoccupation with beauty. The vogue for synesthesia, evoking one sense through another in art, poetry, and music, and even the penchant for art-like scent to evoke moods, emotions, and vague yet keenly felt associations. It signals the abundance of flowers in the paintings of Rossetti in works like Venus Verticordia, and Burne-Jones in, for example, the Briar Rose series, while pointing the way to the floral emblems of the aesthetic movements and decadence, Oscar Wilde's sunflowers and green carnations. At the same time, Burne-Jones's mannered gesture points to the perceived affectation of aesthetes as ridiculed by Gilbert and Sullivan in the satirical play Patience, while his gaunt and enervated appearance references the fleshly school of poetry, the famous critique of Rossetti in Swinburne and Morris, in which the writer Robert Buchanan accused the Pre-Raphaelites of exhibiting a weary, wasting, yet exquisite sensuality. Above all, that one simple gesture of the wallaby sniffing a rose or a flower references the prevalence of sensory stimuli, such as music and perfume, in the art and literature of Victorian aestheticism, while aligning the aesthetics of scent with uncivilized animal behaviors and an unwholesome obsession with the pursuit of beauty. So this talk today explores the central role of scent in pre-Raphaelite and aesthetic movement painting, and argues that fragrant imagery located within Victorian painting was a key inspiration for the scented breeze that passed over swathes of European and American 19th century art, design and visual culture. I'll show you some of the ways in which these artists were inspired by and engaged with scent, from pre-Raphaelitism of the 1850s through aestheticism in the 1860s and 1870s, right through to the international symbolism of the early 1900s. And I'll show how these meanings associated with particular smells and the sense of smell in general informed the interpretation of some key works in ways that might seem surprising to us today, because we simply don't share those ideas now, or at least we don't hold them so deeply. So let me give you a very quick example of how 19th century ideas about smell and disease can inform a painting. And I think it's fitting to show you here a Spencer Stanhope, because he was, of course, Evelyn de Morgan's uncle. So Thoughts of the Past was painted in 1858, exhibited in 1859, but created in 1858, the year of the Great Stench, the year that Parliament adjourned early because the stench of the river was so bad at Westminster that summer, finally prompting the implementation of Bazalgette's new sewage system for London. And the painting shows a prostitute. We can identify her as a prostitute because of her long red Magdalene-like hair, her coral necklace, a symbol of the Medusa, which we see on the table there, the coins on the table, and the fact that she appears to be wearing a man's dressing gown in the middle of the daytime. She has dirty nets, ripped nets, and there are traces of smut here on the window pane. And through the window, we see the smokestacks and the dirty, polluted river. And we know from our own times the kind of fear generated by unseen disease, by the coronavirus. And in 1858, the terror was of stench or miasma emanating from the Thames as the cause of cholera. In this painting, fear around stench is wrapped up in the form of the prostitute. He stands for moral pollution. The implication here is that the prostitute is as polluted as the miasmic River Thames, and that she's tainted by it. While the cultural nuances of stench permeated Spencer Stanhope's Thoughts of the Past, a new interest in sanitation, sewers, sunshine, fresh air and cleanliness extended to the cleaning of old master paintings, prompting an artistic imperative for lighter, brighter, en plein air canvases, for which the Pre-Raphaelites became known. And certainly for the Pre-Raphaelites, the newly cleaned paintings were a revelation. Inspired by the vibrant colours they now saw, they adopted a freshness of palette, a new sanitary approach to art, found, for example, in the brightness of Millais' The Blind Girl, with its scent of fresh, wet grass after the rainbow, the scent, as we shall see, of the rainbow. Millais' The Blind Girl is a painting about sight, blindness and spiritual vision. The painting depicts a blind girl and a younger able-sighted sister or child resting by a wayside. The focal point of the painting is the blind girl's face, with her brilliant red lips and closed eyes, lit up by the sunlight. Here, the girl's quiet stillness suggests a heightened alertness to the scents and sounds that we imagine coming from the meadow, as well as a rapt attention to a spiritual inward vision. In contrast, the younger girl has twisted around and appears to gaze up and across to the double rainbow arching across the sky, while nestling back into the blind girl for refuge, as if amazed by and apprehensive of this sublime spectacle. There's a clear contrast between the blind and able-sighted girls, who are usually interpreted as sisters, as well as a contrast between the blind girl and the viewer. When Millais first exhibited the painting at the Royal Academy in 1856, critics were startled by the minute observation of nature and the luminosity of the painting. Unaccustomed to the jewel-like radiance of Pre-Raphaelite paintings, a critic writing for the Athenaeum remarked on the sweet-meat rainbow of lollipop colours. Indeed, sunlight seems to issue through the painting. So we were reminded that in contrast to the blind girl who is unable to see the colours of the rainbow, we as viewers are privileged to enjoy the bright colours and laborious details of the painting and to appreciate Millais' skill as a painter. And we're invited to feel empathy for the girl, while at the same time appreciating our own fortune in having sight. It's a painting that can be said to be about the visualization of the senses. Touch is inspired by the gentleness of the blind girl's fingers as she draws them along the fragile stem of a harebell, as well as by the damp earth upon which they sit and the warmth of the sunlight in which a butterfly basks. Sorry, it looks like that painting is stretched there. Scent is suggested by the flowers and country air, whilst sound is signalled by the rooks, which we imagine cawing. Yet the concertina, a prominent symbol of sound in the painting, is silent, unplayed on the girl's lap, hinting at the redundancy of the visual for evoking the multisensory world. We as viewers, after all, cannot smell or hear the sounds in the painting. Millais focuses on the enriching influence of the blind girl's remaining senses. The goodness that she radiates is the beauty of God's landscape, channeled through her senses. The scents and sounds of the pasture stream into her, shaping her thoughts and emotions. In the painting, nature is depicted as bountiful. The grass is lush, and on the bank a few harebells flower. Yet Millais also suggests an element of harshness in nature. The ground upon which the two figures sit appears damp, the track muddy, and on the pasture rooks scavenge, and cows and donkeys, beasts of burden, graze. The rainbow that shines against dark storm clouds accentuates this conjunction of the radiant and the bleak, as does the blind girl who, with her glowing skin and glossy hair, appears to radiate health and innate purity, despite her tattered, linsey-woolsey clothes and rough-knuckled hands. The girls, we might imagine, are en route to the town to earn their crust through the concertina. The rooks, shown scavenging for worms, echo their toil. A single heartsease flower peeks through the grass, suggesting meager comfort. With her nose pressed against the folds of the blind girl's head shawl, the younger girl is shown experiencing at once the extraordinary vision of the rainbow, symbol of the covenant, and the ordinary, even comforting smell of old worn fabric. The disparity between the sublime illusion of the distant ephemeral rainbow and the tangible proximity of the shawl which she holds to her face makes the distance between the divine covenant with its promise of salvation and the realities of everyday hardship all the more poignant. Millais may have conceived of the red-haired blind girl as a victim of the 1848 Irish potato famine, during which blindness from epidemic ophthalmia was rife, and 1 million Irish emigrated, many to England. Certainly, the blind girl responds to the severity of the Poor Law of 1834, which made no provision for vagrants. One outcome of the act, however, was a dramatic rise in the number of blind children removed into the care of voluntary institutions for the blind. The 19th century saw a groundswell of charities supporting the blind. The Association Promoting the General Welfare of the Blind was founded in 1854, for example. In this climate, Millais' painting played to growing sentimentality and pity. He shows her wearing a simple headdress and forming a dominant pyramid structure, so drawing on the iconography of the Virgin Mary. He's showing her as one of the deserving poor. Now, my big discovery with this painting came one very exciting day in the British Library when I found a poem which I think Millais may have had in mind, entitled The Blind Girl from 1845 by the Cambridge-educated banker, writer and poet Robert Snow. Here the blind girl addresses her sister. Sister, I have oft suspected to idle grief thou dost incline. Now by the throb thou art detected of thy fingers pressed to mine. Declaring herself full of gratitude for her remaining senses, she explains, I, a stranger, am to weeping, evermore awake or sleeping, flows the current of my joy. Rejoicing in her rich sensorial experience of God's bounty, it is, she says, by the sense sublime of smelling, I know the fields the Lord hath blessed. The blind girl wears a label, pity the blind. Yet Millais creates a sense of pathos, not only by urging our pity and our gratitude for our own senses, but also through recognition that the girl does not deem herself as dispossessed, but as rich with the blessings of the Lord. She enjoys, for example, the concertina music, birdsong, meadow scents, and the warmth of the sun. Snow's poem concludes with the couplet, "For God who made, O kind, beauty for one and all, gave fragrance for the blind." In both painting and poem, far from pitying the blind girl, we're invited to commend her serenity and faith in the Lord, which makes her worthy of Victorian charity. In Snow's poem, it is the sister that weeps, and the blind girl who says, "Sister, I make no vain pretences, weighing thus my gifts with thine, for I have, as thou hast, senses to comprehend that word to shine." And now coming on to this idea of the odour of the rainbow, which got me so excited. Now, what really interests me about this poem is that a stanza of it was cited in Notes and Queries as part of a chain of correspondence on the theme of the odour from the rainbow. And so Notes and Queries was the Victorian print equivalent of an online forum today. So people would write in with questions and the replies would be printed in the following issue. So over several issues, readers exchanged literary references to the odour of the rainbow, the scent of wet earth, grass and flowers when the sun comes out after a rainstorm and a rainbow is to be seen. So the aroma, now known as petrichor, although the word wasn't coined, I think, until the 1960s. The passage cited reads, "Once on the porch while I was resting, to hear the rainbows in their mirth. You said you saw the rainbow cresting, the heavens with colours based on earth. And I believe it fills the showers with music, and when sweeter air than common breeze from briar bowers, I think the rainbow has touched there." So for viewers of the painting, rainbows held deep Christian significance. As a reminder of divine covenant and the promise of redemption, the rainbow suggests the better world to come. By the 19th century, the rainbow was also a symbol of Christ. For example, in 1865, across the Atlantic, the Reverend James Manning Sherwood, a Presbyterian minister in Fayetteville, North Carolina, wrote a passage in the American journal Hours at Home, of which he was editor, that encapsulates this theme. He writes, "Christ is the token of a tempest ended, a darkness past, even as the bough only comes forth when the rain is over and gone. The Sun of Righteousness beams out sweet and clearly in the soul's purified air and gilds the clouds of sorrow and sin. The heart is all fresh and fragrant with new spiritual life, as when the grass and trees sparkle with drops left by a departed shower. Peace and stillness reign, and wide and high in the soul's sky is reared the jeweled arch of hope." Millais' radiant pastoral scene might then be considered a scene of redemption, and as an allegorical sacramental landscape in which communion is achieved through sensorial, indeed synesthetic, appreciation of the natural world. The rainbow signifies God's omnipresence, but it so indeed does scent, and if scent offered a bridge between earth and heaven, the rainbow gives that bridge a visible sign. Of course, The Blind Girl is not Millais' only painting of the period to focus on scent, and indeed the more obvious painting is Millais' Autumn Leaves, a scene of 4 girls tending to a bonfire, a painting about scent, memory of childhood and nostalgia, where the scent of autumn leaves, particularly when tapped into the idea of miasma as the scent of rotting matter, creates a sense of grief just at that moment of the Crimean War. And as the first of Millais' mood pictures, Autumn Leaves moves away from Victorian narrative painting and the religious and literary stories that they'd been focused in their early Pre-Raphaelite paintings towards the spirit of il dolce far niente that characterized Victorian aestheticism. In terms of this history of scent and its role in Victorian aestheticism, it's important because it demonstrates that scented reverie and the notion of intense sensory experiences were central to aestheticism right from its very conception. It's a painting that I write at length about in the book, but suffice here to say that it suggests the emotive power of scent and paves the way for a number of iconic works of Victorian aestheticism in which scent plays a key role. Another key painting in this entwined history of aestheticism and the representation of scent is George Frederick Watts's Choosing from 1864, in which a girl, his newlywed bride, the 17-year-old actress Ellen Terry, is depicted in the process of choosing between the luscious show blooms of the cultivated, unscented red camellia pressed to her face and the handful of humble, sweet-smelling wild violets clutched to her heart. And again, in the book, I write at length about this painting, about the intricacies of meaning implied by this juxtaposition, which we might read as Watts's private commemoration of the process so recently undertaken by Terry of choosing between a flamboyant life on the stage and a comparatively sheltered life as Watts's wife and muse. And of course, in the painting, she's acting the role of smelling a flower. She's not actually smelling it because that camellia doesn't have a smell. Celebrating her move away from an active presence in public life, Watts represents her as a flower with a fusion of the fragrant and the feminine, evoking a hyper image of passive, static, and anonymous femininity. With its glorious colours, fragrant violets, and motifs of smelling, Choosing places scent and synesthesia at the centre of Victorian aestheticism, just as Max Beerbohm later playfully showed it in his cartoon of Dante Gabriel Rossetti in his back garden. This is an early, influential example of a painting in which the motif of a woman smelling a flower with eyes closed is the primary focus. And so a key painting in this 19th century history of scented visions, and my book is full of paintings of women smelling roses with their eyes closed. Indeed, the painter John William Waterhouse surely had it in mind, having either seen it at the home of his patron, Alexandra Henderson, or at the Watts retrospective of 1905, when he worked on the Soul of the Rose around that time. So Dante Gabriel Rossetti, on the other hand, surely saw Watts's Choosing in 1864, when it was first exhibited at the Royal Academy Summer Show. And that year he began work on his own painting of half-length portrait of a woman surrounded by flowers, Venus Verticordia, in which we see a bare-breasted Venus, the goddess of love, as an Eve-like temptress with luscious red lips and cascades of auburn hair embowered in a profusion of full-blown roses and honeysuckle, the sheer density and opulence of which brings to mind a strong floral scent. There's a feeling of visual excess, and the soffit of beauty seems to spill over into the other senses, as if threatening to engulf the viewer in a cloying fragrance. The curling tongues of the honeysuckle, like fragrance trails, lure, even suck in the viewer, like insects. Her own scent, we might imagine, is more intense and seductive than even the flowers that envelop her. Certainly, she's far more potent than the light, simple floral toilet waters that etiquette favoured for English ladies in the 1860s, things like lavender water. In Lady Lilith of 1868, the perfume bottles and dense roses evokes the idea of a heavily sweet and suffocating scent, signifying her beauty and attraction, with the positioning of the figure close to the picture plane creates a sense of airlessness. In both these works, the representation of intense fragrances lends a frisson, thanks to the legacy of miasma theory, the idea that smell was disease, that diseases were spread by smell. And even as this old theory gradually ceded to germ theory in popular understanding, the suggestion of heavy perfume remained deeply perturbing, and so perfect for conjuring deadly seductresses, femme fatales, and witches. We could also think of Rossetti's several versions of Proserpine, in which he evoked scent through the depiction of curling fumes rising from the goddess's censer, and accentuated it through the swirling folds of the figure's dress, the serpentine pose, and the winding ivy, symbolizing clinging memory. Given sense association with memory, the evocation of incense here enhances the idea of the spring goddess imprisoned in the gloom of Hades, brooding over memories of her former life. As in Millais' Autumn Leaves, the idea of Victorian idea of miasma is again at play with regards to the depressive effect of smell upon the body and mind. Having moved quite quickly, just one more example. We might think also of Rossetti's Pandora, and all the evils of the world coming out, escaping from the box is a kind of miasmic fume. And I think, if we were to think about depicting Pandora's box today and all of the evils of the world, we might choose to represent it as a kind of visualizing the coronavirus, perhaps. So having moved quickly over these Rossetti examples, I wanted to slow down to look in more detail at 3 paintings by Rossetti's friend and peer, Simeon Solomon, in order to discuss his approach to aestheticism and the worship of beauty, and his fascination with the sensual elements of high Christian ritualism in his ceremonial works of the 1860s and early 1870s. Raised an Orthodox Jew, Solomon would have been familiar with the role of smell in Hebraic theology and practice, as well as in the customs of Jewish life, as his engravings of Old Testament scenes, Jewish women burning incense and offering incense of 1862 suggest. Jewish tradition was steeped in scented oils and ointments, while incense played a key role in temple worship as being symbolic of prayer, uniting man with God and calming the deity. At the same time, Solomon was drawn to ceremony and ritual across religions, ancient and modern, and with Jewish emancipation and the piecemeal lifting of legal restrictions on Jews in Britain between 1828 and 1858, he had greater opportunities to experience these. Indeed, as art historian Colin Crews argues, he pressed all religions into his service in scenes ranging from the ancient Rome of Heliogabalus to the Old Testament Babylon, and from Greek Orthodoxy to Anglo-Catholic ritualism. In Solomon's body colour on paper, To Acolyte Sensing, Pentecost from 1863, 2 young men approach an altar, with heads inclined as if whispering, their bodies just touching. The intimacy between them is reinforced by the painting's title, To Acolyte Sensing, suggesting a shared participation in this act of swinging the censer. As Crews argues, it is often hard to identify the exact nature of the religious experience and precise denominational position of Solomon's works. Here, however, the title tells us we are looking at the celebration of the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles, while the image suggests the incensing of the altar in preparation for Mass. The gleaming gold of the thurible and candelabra, the shimmering silks of vestment and cassock, the lilies on the altar, and the painting's rich play of reds, golds, greens, and whites creates a highly sensual image. The visual emphasis on the lustrous paraphernalia creates a sense of awe and wonder that brings attention to the unseen divine presence. The watercolour reveals Solomon's attraction to the sensorial aesthetics of Catholic and High Anglican worship, also reflected in his paintings A Deacon and The Mystery of Faith. The sensorial effects, the colour, light, scent and motion of the swaying censer and its chinking chains would have reminded viewers of the multi-sensory ritualism of a Catholic or High Anglican church, at a time when Catholicism and Catholic-inspired ritual within High Anglican churches was on the rise in England and increasingly taboo. At the same time, his depiction of beautiful young men in cassocks pertains to popular homosexual fantasies of the mid to late 19th century about the ambiguous masculinity of Catholic priests and acolytes and their potential relations, as well as the subservience of the congregation kneeling before the priest at Mass. From the 1870s to the early 1900s, it was widely understood that the theatre, costumes, ornamentation, and sheer sensuality of Roman Catholic and High Anglican Church ritual held a hedonistic and even eroticized allure for some homosexual men, and that these churches provided a form of refuge. To paint such a scene was a bold move. Close friends with Rossetti since about 1858, and a leading light of asceticism until his arrest for attempted sodomy in 1873 cost him his friendships, reputation, and career, Solomon would have been acutely aware that critics had blasted early Pre-Raphaelitism for appearing to demonstrate Oxford movement sympathies. So severe was this criticism that Rossetti moved away from overtly religious paintings and for the most part shunned public exhibition. Yet here was Solomon connecting to the current controversy around Catholic ritualism in a painting that challenges the asceticism of Protestant art by mirroring the decorative and artistic imperative of High Anglican interiors, and it hints, however obliquely, at a sensibility of illegal same-sex desire. Daringly, he also implicates the viewer in experience by placing the viewpoint close to the picture plane, as if we share the space and breathe the sacred incense radiating towards us. By 1863, when Solomon was painting two acolytes censing Pentecost, the post-Reformation legality of a liturgical use of incense was a key point of controversy in the Anglican Church, despite its having been forbidden by the Bishop of London in 1858. In fact, ritualism was one of the most hotly debated topics of Victorian life, being a mainstay in the tracts of the Church Association, the evangelists of which led the fight against it, and widely discussed in the press and in cultural commentary. By 1859, the issue had become so polemic that riots broke out in Stepney, London, at the Church of St. George in the East, in response to the use of ritualistic devices such as censing, crosses, lighted candles on the altar, and choir boys. The church's rector, Brian King, had studied at Oxford in the 1840s, where he fell under the spell of the High Church Oxford movement leader, Edward Pusey, whose sermons later inspired King to introduce the theatre of ritual into the bleak lives of the East End poor. Ostensibly an attack on ritualistic liturgy, the riots, which took place every Sunday for 9 months, were marked by anti-Catholic tension sparked by the rise of Catholicism in Britain following the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, the re-establishment of a Roman Catholic ecclesiastical hierarchy in England in 1850, and cemented by mass immigration of the poor, the Irish poor, to England. For the anti-Puseyites, therefore, the smell of incense flung, as one newspaper commentator put it, now over the altar, now over the book from which the gospel is read, and now into the faces of the performers in the chancel, symbolized the perceived taint of popish corruption and idolatry infiltrating the Church of England, as well as fears and prejudices generated by immigration. Hostile accounts of ritualism emphasized the foppery and effeminacy of participating clergymen. To quote the writer Charles Kingsley, who was an advocate of muscular Christianity and Christian manliness, wrote a vitriolic attack on the Oxford movement in 1864. Likewise, a writer for the Times reporting on a service at St. Albans Church in Holborn, London, in 1866, noted the gold and green dresses worn by the priests and commented that the flaunting dresses and candles and odours and gesticulations have in them something almost nauseous to an ordinary English stomach. Though it's not known to have been exhibited, Solomon's two acolytes censing Pentecost, with its glistening vestments, lilies and censers, would have invited direct comparison to the services at St. Albans Church, where, according to art historian Lionel Lambourne, Solomon and his friend Pater attended services. The cultural historian Dominic James has suggested that as Solomon became fascinated with Christian ritualism, he developed a coded language for exploring and legitimating male homosexual identity and sexual acts. For example, James argues that Solomon depicts the ritual of benediction as a metaphor for same-sex intercourse in his watercolour The Mystery of Faith. He points to the phallic monstrance, the vessel that carries the host. Yeah, we can go back. and argues that for the congregation, the ingestion of the wafer as it dissolves on the tongue represents the gratification of physically consuming a man, Christ. While for many, such a concept would have been abhorrent and blasphemous, James argues that Solomon sought to reframe male-on-male intercourse as a form of sacred purification. Building on James's argument, we might point to the phallic nature of the incense burner, ejaculating its purifying scent in Solomon's 2 acolyte censing Pentecost. Like the wafer that is ingested, incense is also taken into the body, the inhalation of the fragrant particles binding the congregation in the shared sacred proceedings and providing a symbolic representation of the invisible action of communion that is taking place. In these and other ways, Solomon sanctifies sex. With its suggestion of a remote and exotic Eastern Orthodox setting, Solomon's watercolour at a Saint of the Eastern Church of 1867-8 was seemingly on safer ground. When it was exhibited at the Dudley Gallery, London in 1868, a critic for the architect gave it nothing but the highest praise, finding its colour chaste and deeming it one of the most attractive works to a refined taste in the gallery. In the painting, a haloed young man in a decorative tunicle with dark hair and deeply introspective gaze carries a sprig of myrtle, and once again a censer emits fumes of incense. From the ceiling, 2 lamps are suspended by chains which appear to be strung with little bells. Made at a key moment within the long-running bells and smells controversy, the work could hardly fail to evoke ritualism despite its Eastern European context. In 1867, charges had been made against the Reverend A.H. Maconochie of St Albans Church in Holborn, London, for censing things and persons, as well as for elevating the host above his head, using a mixed chalice and altar lights, and kneeling during the prayer of consecration. In January 1869, just months after the Dudley Gallery exhibition, the judge Sir Robert Phillimore, Dean of the Archers, was to rule that the ceremonial use of incense during Holy Communion was illegal. The following year, the use of incense in preparation for Holy Communion was ruled illegal in the case of the Bishop of Winchester versus the Reverend Richard Hooker Edward Wicks, and in 1876, judges finally ruled incense burning illegal in church processions. In the 5 years that followed the Public Worship Regulation Act of 1874, 5 clergymen were imprisoned for breaking the law with respect to ritual. Given the intensity of the controversy over incense in 1867 and 68, and the perception of Catholic and high Anglican churches as a haven for illegal homosexuality, Solomon was fortunate to receive such positive reviews, though the Athenaeum described the watercolour as lacking manliness. The art historian Alan Staley suggests that Solomon, who rated it the best work he'd ever done, likely sent it to the summer exhibition, despite the Royal Academy's focus on oil paintings. There, it may have been rejected on the grounds of its medium, or as Staley suggests, because of growing prejudice against the artist's friendship with Swinburne and the poet's marked influence on the homoerotic tenor of Solomon's work. Perhaps, too, the jury turned their noses up at the taint of incense and tinkle of bells, regardless of the Eastern Church setting. Whatever the case, a saint of the Eastern Church resonates with symbolism. Myrtle, sacred to the goddess Venus, traditionally symbolizes everlasting love, but is also associated with shame and nakedness. In classical culture, its leaves shielded Venus from prying eyes, while in Christianity it stood for the scent of the Garden of Eden. Associated with phallic masculine essence or sexual vigor, it was traditional, as Solomon expert Carolyn Conroy has indicated, for Jews to present the fragrant flower to bridegrooms, a recurrent figure in Solomon's work as they enter the nuptial bedchamber. In Judaism, myrtle has a special significance as one of the 4 sacred plants of the Feast of Tabernacles, lacking taste but with sweet spice-scented flowers and mildly aromatic leaves that hint of orange and eucalyptus. It stands for the unlearned Jew who has no knowledge of the Torah, but nonetheless performs good deeds. The Christian Bible also references it as a symbol of God's blessing. Finally, myrtle is associated with perfume since the ancient Greek word for myrtle, myrtos, relates to muron, or scented oil. Myrtle recurs in Solomon's Oeuvre, and as Caroline Conroy argues, he used it to signify love as simultaneously sacred and secular. In A Saint of the Eastern Church, he juxtaposes the phallic thurible with its purifying release of incense, and the fragrant myrtle, which is suggestive of love, sexual potency, good deeds, and God's blessing. In this way, the painting might suggest male love and male orgasm as divine forces for good that, like the myrtle, emanate fragrant goodness. At the same time, myrtle's association with hiding and shame is intriguing, given the context of Victorian homophobia. From Solomon's incense paintings, it's no great leap to international symbolism and works such as Knopf's incense. And indeed, scent is suggested in works by symbolists ranging from Margaret MacDonald Mackintosh, Edgar Maxence, Jan Terroup, Edmond Amongine, and Adeline Redon, just as a few examples. Indeed, in the realms of fine art, the emotiveness of smell appealed to numerous painters seeking to convey inner truths and vague and unspeakable longings. But I couldn't finish, of course, without referencing as well the work of Evelyn de Morgan, whose art straddles Victorian aestheticism and international symbolism. De Morgan looked to the 15th century Florentine painter Sandro Botticelli, not only for his fresh, vivid style and truth to nature, but also for his ability to evoke the intangible, a sea breeze, a scented glade, the hush of night. The poppies strewn by the figure of sleep in De Morgan's Night and Sleep take direct inspiration from the roses tumbling in the sea breeze in Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, as the wind god Zephyr and his wife Chloris blow Venus to shore. Oh, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. The painting had a profound influence upon De Morgan's work after she saw and copied it in the Uffizi in the 1870s. Although the poppies are unscented, the fluttering petals in De Morgan's painting evoke the idea of a soporific perfume. They also allude to the devastation of opium and laudanum addiction that was rife in Victorian Britain. The fluttering petals suggest scent in Night and Sleep. In the Cadence of Autumn from 1905, we have a ribbon of smoky violet paint, evoking the scent of autumn leaves as leaf litter is swept up and swells in the breeze. It's a theme she returns to in Boreas and the Fallen Leaves of 1919, in which we have the suggestions of puffs of autumn leaf aroma blown on the wind. In both these works, De Morgan was drawing upon the stylized fragrance trails that emerged in European symbolist paintings and then in Art Nouveau graphic design. So I hope I've shown that scent played a significant role in Victorian aestheticism. There are, of course, many more examples that I go into in the book. In the book, I also argue that Victorian aestheticism played a key role in disseminating the visual depiction of scent in European 19th century art across a wide range of movements, Orientalism, Impressionism, American Impressionism, for example. So I hope you'll enjoy reading it. It's the first book to explore the role of smell in 19th century painting. And it's taken me, Sarah was asking me how long I've been working on it. I think it's taken me 23 years to write, as long as Darwin's Origin of the Species. But friends have told me that they zipped through it at pace. I've tried to make it a lively read, and you can get 30% off with this code NR22 from Pennsylvania University Press's website. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. I confess I haven't got around to buying the book yet, but certainly will be doing after that talk, and I'm sure many other people on the call will be inspired to do the same. Such an interesting way of reframing some paintings that we're very familiar with, which I always think is interesting, and to bring those in new interpretations to the pictures. It can open up so much discussion, can't it? You know, sort of going down the avenues of disease and disease spreading in the Victorian period, right up to taking a different look at religion and what part that played in society at the time as well. So brilliant talk. I'm sure everyone agreed, and I can see lots of lovely words of thanks coming through in the chat box as well. Do let me know if you have any questions you'd like me to put to Christina. And in the meantime, I had one. You know, it was so, like I say, so wonderful to see how the painting's kind of a reflection on, and also a tool for sort of social history and understanding that. But what I wondered was whether art critics at the time, in your research, if you found any kind of examples of people understanding the important role of smell in paintings.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually some critical reviews that got me into the subject in the very first place. I did my 3 degrees on art history. When I was studying for my undergraduate degree, I wrote my dissertation on the language of health and disease and the critical response to Dante Gabriel Rossetti. A wordy dissertation title there. But so I was writing about critics who were describing Rossetti's paintings as kind of overly sensual and diseased. And there was one paragraph where I looked at some critics who described his poetry and also his paintings as emanating a kind of sickly sweet cloying fragrance that would come out of the painting. And there was one that even sort of hinted at emasculating the male reader in that case. And I just thought that was fascinating. And then meanwhile, I found some examples of Millais' paintings being described as kind of more of sort of fresh air and heather, I think because of his Scottish Highlands paintings. And he's more of a sort of sporting personality, whereas Rossetti was perceived as sort of living in the darkness as a recluse in his Chelsea house. So that sort of made me really fascinated by metaphors of smell. And then I developed the idea of it further during my undergraduate, my master's degree at the Courtauld. And then it became my thesis topic later on. So yeah, there are critical responses scattered through the book that touch on smell in all sorts of interesting ways.
Wonderful, thank you. Any more questions from the audience for Christina? If not, I'm going to take a huge liberty of asking another one. Just to sort of ask you a bit more generally, whether there was a kind of a distinction with how artists use smell for positive and negative connotations, and whether they would still perhaps be the same as we would read the paintings with our social context today.
In terms of negative connotations, there aren't many depictions of just kind of foul of stench in paintings, and I think that has to do with the sort of 19th century ideal that art is about beauty. You're kind of dating back to Joshua Reynolds' treatises, for example, this sort of idealization. So there's not much kind of visualization of stench. Where stench is maybe suggested, it tends to be rather than visualized as a smell, it's more sort of evoked as a crowd scene, or a dirty pavement or something like that. Primarily, where smell is depicted in paintings, it's a good smell. It's a floral scent or a perfume, something like that. But as I showed you with the Rossetti, a sweet perfume can have this kind of negative connotations of being too strong, too miasmic, and therefore kind of having either a seductive effect on the viewer, or suggesting something about the morality of the person smelling that odor. But there are also works, particularly I think as you get away from the mid-Victorian period, more towards the end of the century, where maybe it's a young girl smelling flowers or something, and it's very kind of saccharine, and just sort of suggesting the beauty of the child or the simplicity of the child. So that's certainly a kind of strong theme. But I think really, you may have to dig deep, but I think always there will be 19th century connotations of smell implicit in those works, if you know what to look for, really, and how to kind of think about it. I don't think the connotations of paintings will ever be exactly the same as now, because we just don't think about smell in the same ways today.
Lovely, thank you very much. And like I said, it certainly gives us an additional lens through which to look at the paintings and to pick out some of these interpretations. I've not had any other questions from our audience, Christina, just lots of words of thanks coming too. So unless anybody can think of anything last minute that they're keen to ask, I will say thank you to you so much for joining us this afternoon, and to, you know, for sharing the context of your book, and congratulations. It's been such a labour of love for you, and it's fantastic to finally have it here and to share these ideas. So thank you so much, Christina. Thank you to everybody who's watching either live on the Zoom today or on YouTube later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah. Jenny. Sarah. Sorry, I'm confused by Jenny's name popping up in the chat here. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's great. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.